Welcome to Wii Missed, where I find and play those Nintendo Wii games that got lost in time, and today we're playing a game that gets suggested constantly as a hidden gem for the Wii, but is it? Let's check it out. Episode 10, Lost in Shadow, also known as A Shadow's Tale in other regions. Like I just hinted at, if you look at any list of hidden gems on the Wii, I honestly think Lost in Shadow might have been the most suggested game, which might make it not so hidden anymore, but it's one game I've had in my mind for this series since I started. I did not have it growing up, so I'm looking at this one with a fresh set of eyes, and yeah, I've been curious about it for quite some time. When loading up Lost in Shadow here for the first time, we are given an opening cutscene where a shadow is separated from a boy and kind of relentlessly tossed over the edge of a tower. We awaken at the bottom of the tower as this shadow, and it's apparent that we will need to climb to the top. Each level in Lost in Shadow is broken up into a series of floors, some spanning multiple floors, giving the game an immediate sense of verticality like a modern Metroidvania game might have versus traditional side-scrolling platformers. As the Shadow, there isn't a whole lot we can do here besides jump, duck, and crawl. None of these actions are quick or snappy, so it's more of a lumbering shadow is how I would describe it. But that's obviously not the focus per se of the game. As you can see, we are running in the background of the screen along the shadows cast by the objects in the foreground. It takes a second to adjust your eyes to where to look when playing, but not bad, and we'll dive more into this concept in a bit. Almost immediately, we are given a rusty sword as a weapon, which, spoiler alert, is one of the only weapons you will ever use in the game. You can't do much with it besides some basic 3-part swings, and these are essentially the 3 main focuses of Lost in Shadow: the platforming, these shadow-based puzzles, and combat. Before we dive deeper into these 3 core components, there are some basic gameplay elements to be aware of. Health works a little different than you might think. Basically, your health is equivalent to the weight of your shadow, which I know doesn't make a ton of sense on the surface, but mechanically it works well. If you take damage, your weight simply decreases, with a level over if it completely drains. As you explore, you'll see these purple orbs and statues, which act as a 2-part thing. Finding them will increase your max weight or max health, and 2, the statues provide snippets of the game's story or in-game hints. Lost in Shadow basically has no overt story to show us outside of that opening cutscene and a few chapter introductions later on, so you're kind of just piecing together the puzzle of why any of this is happening by reading these little quips every time you come across one of them on a level. Something else you'll notice besides the weight bar at the top of the screen is a purple level up bar right below it. As you kill enemies or solve puzzles, you can level up, making your shadow stronger, although there's nothing visually or mechanically that will feel any different when that happens. Another element are these shadow corridors or doors, and there's usually just 1 per level. When entering one of these doors, represented by a mysterious black fog, you teleport to an alternate realm mid-level to complete a shadow and perspective-based puzzle. After completing this puzzle, or platforming challenge sometimes, you're given a ton of health and level up orbs and teleport back to the main level, and it continues on. These sections emphasize the impact of shadows on gameplay by really stripping the level down to pretty much just the basics, so you can focus on how the shadows play off of each other. They also act as a very necessary break from the monotonous level design throughout the main part of the game. And finally, the main collectible in the game are these 3 orange eye-like things on each level, which is your main goal in order to open the gate to the next level. Alright, so let's talk a little bit about the shadows themselves. Obviously, the gameplay hook here is how shadows impact the level design in the game. Besides the default object shadows in the game cast by objects towards the front of the screen, there are times where you will control the actual lighting in the game, which in turn changes where you can walk in the background. This is where the game is at its best, and it's unfortunate this mechanic is only used in set spots, and usually not all that difficult to figure out when it happens. Essentially, either a horizontal or vertical slider will pop up on the screen when you get to a dead end, changing the angle of the light emanating towards the objects in the front. This will move the shadows in the back accordingly, allowing you to reach things you might have not been able to do before. It's really neat. Controlling the light with the Wii remote pointer in your right hand while moving and jumping with the nunchuck in your left hand is clever and feels very solid. The problem is this gameplay mechanic is used so sparingly when it really should have been the main focus. There are also times where you'll interact with foreground objects to rotate them, but similar to controlling the light, it's not really as interesting or clever as it sounds in practice. The last shadow-related mechanic comes much later in the game, where you'll teleport through gates to the foreground portion of the level, temporarily turning into a 3D ghost of yourself, which is such a clever idea. Through most of the game, you're so focused on the background shadows, and then all of a sudden, the foreground comes into play. It's honestly a shame this mechanic is introduced so late in the game. The first time this happens is literally on level, I think it was 40 something out of the 60 or so floors. This is where the level design shines the brightest, and you will run in 3D along the floors of the same sections you couldn't access before as a shadow. Thinking about this now, and man, if the whole game played off of this mechanic from the start, it honestly would have been amazing, but I'll have to settle here for when it actually comes into play in the latter third of the game. In terms of non-shadow related concept, where the game spends way too much of its time is with combat, and it's extremely clunky. I almost feel like the game would have been better served without any combat at all, but with a clear lack of depth to the level design, even with the shadow element at work, it probably would have been too empty or feel too empty for that to make sense. Essentially, you'll spend a ton of time killing boring and repetitive shadow creatures, where the game really should have sunk into the lighting puzzles that made it so unique to begin with. The combat never really changes from a clunky sword swing, which also has extremely questionable reach and hit detection and a slight animation delay. Because of this, most of my deaths felt undeserved, mostly from being what felt like a pixel or two off with my slow sword swings, and I can't emphasize enough how clunky this is in practice. The platforming side to the equation is equally clunky too though. It's fine for the basics of jumping over obstacles or climbing ladders, but when you have to make quick decisions such as with these chase sequence levels, there's no sense of momentum at all, and turning from one direction to the next is extremely slow. This unfortunately becomes more of a problem later in the game when quicker actions are required, and you will be frustrated at times with the lack of response from your shadow. The third major negative aspect to the game is the level design in general, which is unfortunately as equally repetitive as the combat. Each set of 10 or so floors on this massive tower has a different theme, but it all looks pretty much the same honestly, and for a game with such an interesting concept to be held back by some of the most drab visuals you'll find in a platforming game is a bit disappointing. 90% of these puzzles are find this switch over here to open this gate over there, and that's so boring, and the visuals don't help. Now every once in a while the game mixes up a regular level with something else. For example, there's a shadow monster chase level early on, and another one that focuses on using mining carts of sorts, but these level switch ups are simply too few and far between. And again, the best gameplay aspect when the game has you jumping between the foreground and the background simply comes into play way too late. Now, in terms of progression in the game, as you work through all these levels, you'll eventually climb up to level 55, where the game switches things up and makes you backtrack down the tower to find all these gems. I think it was 6 in total. I honestly don't even want to comment on how annoying this was to do. I was pretty much over it at this point, but essentially we were told that we were missing a total of 6 gems that are scattered randomly on the previous 55 levels that we just climbed. What's more annoying are the 5 or 6 levels that we need to go to can only be accessed by taking an elevator to a different level that's somewhat near the ones we actually need to go to, which means needlessly backtracking through like 3 or 4 levels for each of these gems. I honestly feel the game should have just opened these sections up immediately and had these gameplay mechanics from the start versus forcing us to replay them just to collect one single object. The weird pacing this game has, along with those visuals, the clunky combat, and repetitive level design, all detracts from what should have been a truly amazing experience. Anyways, after collecting these 6 gems, the game again sends us on a batch of 10 levels to the Dark Tower, and it seems like this is where the game is actually going to end. Story-wise, after completing the Dark Tower, you would think this would be a natural ending to the game. It even ends with probably my favorite chase sequence in the game. You then have to somewhat randomly go through another hour or two's worth of garden levels to get to the final boss. These levels are a bit more convoluted than the main tower levels, but they really just feel tacked on to extend the runtime. And yeah, after finally getting through these random garden levels, you take on the final boss, the same weird blob made up of the shadows and arms that was chasing us earlier. Once defeated, credits roll, and Lost in Shadow is finally complete, with a runtime of roughly 15 hours from start to finish. Let's get to our final grades. Gameplay gets a C, which again is so unfortunate considering the concepts introduced here. The incredibly monotonous platforming, combat, and level design overpowers any of the good stuff with the shadow and lighting based puzzles that it becomes more of an exercise in frustration. And I have to say it, this is probably the worst paced game I've ever played, with some of the worst backtracking I've ever seen. If the game was cut back in some areas and better paced, it would have been so much better. On to controls, and this gets a C as well. I enjoyed whenever I could use the Wii pointer to play with the light meters on the bottom and the top, and complete a puzzle with moving the shadows, but everything else is clunky at best. The combat never evolves, and I honestly wonder, like I said before, if it would be better without it. My Wii-ness grade, on the other hand, gets an A. It's hard to imagine how this game would work exactly without the Wii controls, but when the game is utilizing the lighting sliders with the Wii remote and running around with the nunchuck, that's awesome. My technical score here gets a C-. The game functionally works well, but the lack of direction and questionable object detection should have been cleaned up before release. And finally, longevity also gets a C-, as the platforming here is simply too boring, slow, and clunky, especially when compared to modern 2D puzzle platformers. There really isn't much of a reason to go back to this game other than the simple fact it exists only on the Wii. Overall, conceptually, Lost in Shadow is an A+ idea with a poor execution. The concept of a platforming game where you control a shadow while simultaneously controlling the light with the Wii remote is one of the most clever uses of game design on the Nintendo Wii that you will find. And then those levels at the end that combine the 2D and 3D sections are just awesome, but are introduced way too late. It's simply too bad that the game design is such a mixed bag overall, with atrocious pacing and very dated platforming ideas, which when surrounded by those tired visuals, drops the final grade for Lost in Shadow to just a C. I still recommend giving it a try if you have the patience, and maybe even adding it to your collection. Just be ready for the absolute grind and a surprising lack of a wow factor for a game with such a unique concept. Anyways, thanks for watching this episode of Wii Missed, everyone. As always, please try to suggest some games in the comments for me to check out next in a future episode, and I'll catch you guys next time.